All right. Thank you, Di, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It is a very exciting webinar that we are preparing. First of all, because it's on this side of the world. So for once, we don't have to wake up in the middle of the night to attend an IHEA webinar. So yay. And second, because we have a great range of panelists who are going to talk today about algorithm decision making in clinical care. This is organized by the Special Interest Group in the Economics of Digital Health. And my name is Susan Mendes at the University of Melbourne, and I'm co-hosting and co-organizing this with Marco Liverani, who will introduce himself in a second. We are going to have a little bit of an introduction from the speakers. Then we're going to kick it off with some questions. But this is a webinar, and because we're not too many people in the room, feel free to ask questions. Just raise your hand and or paste your question in the chat, and I'll try to read questions as they come through. Marco, off you go.
Hi, thanks, Susan. So my name is Marco, and I'm an associate professor in health policy and system at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the University of Nagasaki in Japan as well. So welcome to this seminar on algorithmic decision-making in healthcare. So in this session, we will explore how algorithms are transforming the way clinical decisions are made and what this means for health systems, providers, and patients. So an algorithm basically is a step-by-step set of instructions which are designed to perform a task or solve a problem. In healthcare, algorithms often underpin digital tools that support diagnosis, patient management, and referral. And this can be simple rule-based systems, such as checklist or flowchart, or complex machine learning models that analyze vast amounts of data to predict outcomes or provide recommendations. Now, algorithmic decision-making is gaining a lot of prominence as health systems worldwide seek to improve efficiency, reduce variability in care, costs, and also expand, particularly actually expand access to quality services. And especially in places with shortage of doctors and diagnostics, digital algorithms can help frontline health workers make evidence-based decisions by providing guidance at the point of care. However, the integrations of algorithms and artificial intelligence into clinical workflows raises important questions. How are these tools designed, validated, and implemented? What are the underlying sort of theoretical assumptions? Do they reinforce existing biases or create new ones? Do they lead to the skillings of the health workforce? And what impact do they have on patient-provider relationships? So, and importantly, how can we ensure that these tools are used in an ethical and equitable way? So, today we will discuss the potential and pitfall or algorithmic decision-making and the use of artificial intelligence. The presenters will share their expertise, experiences from the field, including a project I have been closely involved in with Chris and Abhijit, who will talk next. So we hope this session will stimulate critical reflection and some collaborative thinking on how to use algorithms in a responsible way, supporting sort of better decisions, better care, and better health for all. Thanks again. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Marco. So I'm Christopher Chu. I'm a clinician researcher. I'm an infectious diseases and respiratory physician at Canberra Hospital, and my academic affiliations are with Oxford and the Mahidol Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit in Bangkok. I'll be presenting jointly with Abhijit Mishra. So we work together on this project called EDAM, which we'll talk about. I'm the PI of the project. Marco was very heavily involved in the design of the intervention, and Abhijit was the point man, on the ground. So if I can share the screen. Let me try and find the that one. Share. Can you see the screen now? Great, thank you. So the project that we worked on was called EDAM, Electronic Clinical Decision Support for Acute Fever Management. I'm just going to give a 1-minute overview of what it actually involved. So EDAM was an algorithmic clinical decision support app, and we designed this app targeted at rural primary health workers who would be seeing patients presenting with acute febrile illnesses, i.e. People with fever of less than 14 days, in duration, which is a very, very common thing in South and Southeast Asian low and middle income countries. The app itself is guideline and expert rule based in terms of the algorithm. There was no AI involved. But it did incorporate point of care tests like malaria, rapid diagnostic tests, CRP tests, and also pulse oximetry. And we were very interested in how the app would affect prescribing practices by the health workers, and also how they would make decisions on who to refer on to hospital. And we gathered this evidence through a cluster randomized trial in Battambang province in Cambodia, which just finished recruitment in the middle of January this year. And Abhijit will share, the insights and the lessons that we learned, not just about the app, but also, the process of collecting the evidence to support, future iterations and rollout. What we were really interested in as a measurable primary outcome was antibiotic prescription rates between the intervention arm, which did have the app, versus a control arm, which didn't. And then there were various, safety-related secondary outcomes. The full protocol is published in BMJ Open. I put a little link there, but I forgot. But you can, search for it in PubMed. So yes, over to you, Abhijit.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for giving overall introduction to EDAM. Hello and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you for joining this webinar. I'd also like to thank Susan and Marco for inviting me to speak. And this very much aligns with what we are working on, the topic today, algorithm decision-making in healthcare worker. I'd like to share my screen. Yes, so today's topic, which I'm going to talk on, is lessons learned from implementing a cluster randomized trial of an electronic clinical decision support algorithm for acute febrile illness in rural Cambodian primary health center. There is no conflicting interest of the authors. So, as Chris mentioned earlier, acute febrile illness is one of the most common presentations in primary health centers, especially in Cambodia, South, and in Southeast Asia. Traditionally, malaria was thought to be the #1 cause of fever, but due to development of rapid diagnostic tests, the malaria burden has reduced significantly. So this has led researchers to think about other diseases, other causes of fever. However, the challenge is the healthcare workers in Cambodian setup are semi-skilled and they lack diagnostic tools and clinical skills, which causes overprescriptions of antibiotics, which is one of the major problems in this region. So this created a gap in the diagnosis of acute febrile illness. So where this EDAM comes, which is a algorithm-based tool for optimizing acute febrile illness, which we call EDAM, Electronic Clinical Decision Support for Acute Fever Management, which is a pragmatic cluster randomized trial where we had 30 health centers which were randomized into 15 intervention and 15 control arms, as you can see in the map, from 3 different operational districts. And we enrolled patients, those who were aged more than 1 year with fever and were acute presentations. We also provided intensive pretrial training, and also we also gave refresher trainings in between, and also provided SOPs electronically through Google Drive, and also in a booklet form in each health center. We also created a Telegram group chat where we had dedicated research team to support the healthcare workers to troubleshoot any problems which arise during the recruitments. So this is the main study, and the talk which I'm talking about today is about this study, which is one of the sub-study, which the main objective of this study was to describe and characterize the challenges and lessons learned from implementing this digital health intervention in rural Cambodia. So the methods which we used was mixed method approach. We did pre-trial and post-trial usability acceptability surveys. We did structured observations in 12 PSCs. And the results which were app-related challenges which we found was one of the major challenges was time constraint. That is, the mean time for intervention arm to complete EDAM form was approximately 33 minutes, whereas compared to control arm was only up to 15 minutes. And this further complicated when there was busy days where there were 50 patients, healthcare worker had to consult. Another one of the major challenges were binary symptom questions, which is just a yes or no question, which imagine when healthcare workers has already seen 45 patients and the patient who is waiting in the line for 45 patients. And then the clinicians asks the question about vomiting, did you vomit? And the answer is going to come frustrated patient and healthcare worker both. The answer would be just yes or no. So there is no scope for severity, whether it was profuse vomiting or just a scanty amount of vomiting. So that was one of the challenges which highlights the nuanced questioning and additional training approach. Also context related challenges such as technological barriers. We observed that healthcare workers, those who were not familiar with the modern gadgets, had slower recruitments. Also the patient follow-up. Most of the participants are from rural part of Cambodia, where they rely on forest for their daily living. So in the forest, there is no reception of mobile, and it was hard to follow up. Also, it would be hard to appreciate that most of the people don't use mobile phones. They rely someone in the family for communication. So that was one of the challenges. But we mitigated this with collaboration with the village level healthcare workers and also village leaders to help locate these patients. Also, you know, Cambodia is a tropical country, extremely hot and humid. So afternoons become very hot, and in rainy season, there is quite a rain. So the muddy roads become flooded, which affects the recruitment. Also, we trained 3 healthcare workers in each primary health center, but they also had to do works in the community, such as vaccination and other administrative works, which made enrollment a little bit difficult because of the shortage. So the main part of the talk, what we learned was user-centered design is critical. Aligning digital health tools with daily habits, clinical habit of healthcare worker, and also keeping in mind the training and capabilities of the healthcare worker is important, and also the pre-trial training and the feedbacks gained during that pre-trial training was very important. Also the stakeholder engagement. We worked very closely with provincial health department and the regular visits to the field with representative from provincial health department really motivated healthcare workers. Also collaborating with the local NGO called AHEAD facilitated follow-ups. We also need to balance efficiency and comprehensiveness by either streamlining algorithms or adding offline functionality to reduce the time burden. And also one of the important lessons was adapting to the local context. For example, staff shortage, environmental factors, technological literacy, these all has to be kept in mind. So the innovation and significance of digital tools, digital health interventions are newer things in modern medicine, and it's quite rare in rural part, in low middle income country contexts. And so though EDAM showed promises in optimizing AFI management, but it's also had a lot of challenges and issues. So the experience which we gained from EDAM and the lessons that we learned, I hope will help the researchers and policymakers to develop a digital health solution for low and semi-skilled healthcare workers in low resource settings. I would like to acknowledge our funding partner, Wellcome Trust, AC Research Grant to Christopher Chu, and also the participants, healthcare workers, patients, and stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhijit. That was fascinating. I would like to now moving to another complete different setting. Portia, would you like to take it over?
Thank you so much. I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm, Portia Cornell. I am a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne in the Center for the Digital Transformation of Health. And I thought I would use my allotted 5 minutes to talk a little bit about a project that we are working on at the Center for Digital Transformation of Health with a clinical research collaborator in oncology, working on an AI-supported tool to assist in calculating the correct chemotherapy dose for patients with colorectal cancer. So pardon me as an economist while I dive into my clinical understanding, and I apologize ahead of time for anything I get wrong, but as I understand it, the standard for clinical care for chemotherapy dosing is based on a calculation of body surface area, which is a basic piece of algebra using height and weight to calculate the appropriate dose of chemotherapy. But of course, sort of as you might expect, this causes problems when a patient's ratio of lean muscle mass to adipose tissue or fat differs from the average. So a great example of this is a patient who experiences sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting. It's actually quite common in patients who have metastatic cancer. So they have a much higher ratio of fat tissue to lean muscle, meaning that the chemotherapy agents don't leave their system as quickly, they aren't metabolized the same way. And so patients with sarcopenia have a much higher risk of experiencing dose-limiting toxicities from their chemotherapy. So there have been a lot of papers in the last 10 years or so saying, hey, why are we using this kind of very simple height and weight race calculation for chemotherapy when we have much more advanced methods for calculating lean body mass? And all of these cancer patients are getting CT scans anyway, from which we could be calculating this. The answer is and so there have been a lot of papers showing, there have been a few clinical trials showing that chemotherapy dosing based on lean body mass rather than this simple body surface area calculation leads to much lower rate of dose-limiting toxicity. So our collaborators, Justin Jung and his colleagues, but the problem is that surgeons don't really have a way of actually putting this into practice. So our collaborators are working on a project right now. They've developed an AI-supported tool that will do this calculation from a CT scan. It'll take the scan, it'll interpret the image, and it will recommend the correct chemotherapy dosing. So from the economist point of view, this is my kind of mock-up of how we would normally think about modeling the cost effectiveness of using an AI-supported decision support tool technology like this. So this is a simple decision tree, and I've kind of set it up here as thinking about kind of like the way that you would model the cost of a decision tree for a diagnostic test. And in very simple terms, we think about the AI-supported algorithm as being able to generate a true positive or a false positive for whether a patient has sarcopenia, meaning, does their appropriate dose of chemotherapy depart substantially from what that sort of body surface area recommendation would be. And based on that paper that I had up on that previous slide, they've got approximately 85% accuracy in being able to identify kind of a correct dose that departs from BSA. Whereas the usual standard of care, we'll just call that 0% because the usual standard of care would just dose a patient based on that old recommendation. And then based on some clinical trials comparing lean body mass dosing to body surface area dosing, really big differences in patients experiencing neurotoxic chemotherapy, neurotoxic effects from chemotherapy. So like, 43% in patients who, who are in that true positive group who get that lean body mass dose, 66% in patients who get just sort of like the standard of care body surface area dose. So this is normally how we would often start to conceptualize the cost effectiveness, right? We sort of multiply out these probabilities, think about the value of information that we get from this test and get sort of costs and consequences balanced against the cost of implementing the tool at each of these arms. However, I think that there's a big question mark over the top part of this decision tree here. And possibly I might even call it a missing node where we might want to expand our tree a little bit, which is that we have another decision node, or maybe we can even call it a chance node around, is the oncologist actually adjusting their treatment plan according to what the tool is recommending? Which I think is not often a question that we incorporate into our models with drug dosing, right? Like someone or economic modeling of a drug, right? Someone either gets the drug or they don't get the drug. But with a clinical decision support tool, it's a little more complicated. Are they, quote unquote, getting the tool if an oncologist has consulted the tool or has the tool but doesn't consult it, or has consulted the tool but has decided for whatever reason, like not to follow its recommendation? And so there are a lot of sort of like complicated reasons behind why they might not follow that recommendation that I think my colleague Kit is going to dive into a little bit further. And then the next sort of like, because we are here in an economics association, I feel like we have to ask that economic question, which is that if this is a cost-effective tool and this is a cost-effective thing to do, how are our payment designs structured to incentivize use of these tools? So that kind of brings me to my discussion points, and some of them are sort of normative and some of them are just questions. I think my normative statement is that methodologically, our models ought to maybe explicitly consider behavior change as a chance node in a decision tree when we're trying to model the economic impact of tools like this. And I feel like maybe, the pragmatic trial where there was sort of some differences in, some pragmatic problems in whether or not clinicians were actually using tools is just like a great entree into this. interested in the conversation about that. And then accounting for, there are problems in that research context, but when you go from research to implementation, the adoption is going to be potentially even more problematic. And how do we account for that uncertainty in our estimates? How do the usability, the trust, user-centered design, workflow considerations, how do we account for all of those in our parameterization of this kind of adoption probability? And then what methods can we use to try and figure out what those are prospectively, or figure out, prospectively how they should be measured in a trial? And then my second discussion point is, in Australia, the Medicare benefit schedule will pay for an oncologist's time to sit with a patient and discuss treatment options. And it'll pay for a lab test, if they, or a genetic test for individualized genetic therapy, for example. But right now, it's not structured in such a way to pay specifically for that oncologist to invest in a digital tool, right? So they're free to use any tools, whether everything from Microsoft Word to the most advanced AI, but they're supposed to basically use the existing time reimbursement to support investing in those tools. And do we need to think about different ways to set up the design? Like, should we be thinking more about how can we incentivize adoption of cost-effective technologies without introducing sort of unintended consequences, or proliferation of different technologies that haven't been appropriately tested? And I will end it there and really pass it along to my colleague, Dr. Huckville.
Thanks so much, Portia. And thanks, Susan and Marco, for the opportunity to join the conversation today. I just want to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm joining the call from, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And if there are any First Nations people on the call, you are especially welcome in the conversation where we're talking about equity, amongst other things. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm a clinician by training, a computer scientist, and now I'm director of an experiment we're running at the University of Melbourne to make specialist skills and research expertise available to people who are trying to develop digital health tools. And I think in that capacity, we get to see a whole load of projects, especially and increasingly projects in the AI and clinical decision support and algorithmic tools space. And Portia has described one of them. And I guess I'm questing for what have I learned or observed in aggregate across those, and maybe sharing something as a sort of starting point for our discussion today. And I think it's this, which is that often as health services researchers, we get things almost as products to evaluate. And I think in the space of AI and ML, where we're essentially blending computer science together with medicine and health services research, there is a real question of not just what we are measuring or trying to measure through processes like evaluation, but really whether that is enough, and whether what we're measuring is the right thing, and also where it fits in the evaluation process and actually the development process. And so to unpack that, I want to share 3 examples from the literature which have stood out to me over the last few years. And I hope to draw those together in a way that persuades you that this is a slightly thorny challenge that we have in front of us. Some of these may be familiar to you, so I apologize in advance. So the first is, I think, pretty well known. Epic is one of the largest electronic medical record vendors in the world. A few years ago, they developed and deployed an AI algorithm for detecting sepsis amongst inpatients. And ultimately, they had to withdraw that. There was a global recall of that product because although it performed well during initial testing, internal testing by that team, when it was rolled out and when it started to be evaluated in practice, the performance that was observed was pretty shockingly bad. This from one study where at a representative use case of the tool in a certain hospitalized context, you had sensitivity rates as low as 33%, so only a third of patients being detected, and specificity equally important, around 86%. And if you play that out, noting that about 7% of folk in a hospital will encounter sepsis at some point in their journey, that means that about 7 people out of every 100 will get sepsis, but the algorithm would only find maybe 2 of them. But it would flag 15 people as having sepsis. And so 13 out of those 15 people were false positives. And I think that highlights that there are multiple costs when these tools go wrong. So there's the cost and the outcomes related harms of the direct failure to detect sepsis. But then there are also myriad ancillary costs around things like workload impacts when staff are having to attend to alerts for patients who aren't actually unwell. And so immediately we have a challenge of multiple potential pathways we have to examine from the point of view of evaluation. My second example is much simpler. This isn't an algorithmic tool in an AI sense, but it's a rules-based system that was deployed in a series of US hospitals back in a few years ago to flag patients who were at risk of acute kidney injury for whom you might want to make a decision, for example, to reduce doses of drugs that are known to be nephrotoxic. What they found in a pretty well-structured and careful analysis was that in at least some sites, this tool was independently increasing the risk of death. So 25% of patients in non-teaching hospitals who were being displayed an alert were dying compared to those with the same symptom profile, the same risk profile, who were not shown an alert. And despite the best efforts of this author and of this paper, and they spent a lot of time to unpack it, they weren't able to attribute cause. And so there is also the potential in this space for complex socio-technical phenomena to arise that are quite hard to unpack, especially after the fact. And the third example I want to share is, again, at sort of high level, and it relates to decision support systems in general. And I think this connects a little bit to what Abby and Chris were sharing around the experience of clinicians and their workload experience in relation to these tools. So for example, I think we know that clinical staff have unparalleled ability to vote with their feet when it comes to their work practices. And actually, this question of whether tools fit into their routines can be a real decider of whether or not things actually get used. And so we know, for example, from this study that when there is any kind of workload friction, it immediately reduces the chance that clinicians are going to use the tool over a 12-month period by about 50%. And that can really mean the difference between viability or non-viability in terms of the economic case, for example, of a tool. So if we pull all those together, I think there are a few corollaries. So I think one is that there is real scope for actual patient harm here. I think it's really important to acknowledge that in this discussion. Even simple tools can lead to harm affecting patients. And related to that, I think that we know that technical models that you may observe during development of the kind we saw in EPIC are actually rarely replicated in real world use. And related to that, the things that our computer science colleagues consider as state-of-the-art performance may still not be good enough performance in clinical use cases. And I think the EPIC example really typifies that. A specificity of 86% is considered good. When it comes to rare conditions, when you factor that in, it means that you're going to have false positives. And that the negative consequences of that in terms of workload, I think we've seen. Stating the obvious, but detecting these issues after deployment is clearly suboptimal. And so I think this then starts to connect to my point that actually these measurement concerns and questions are not necessarily something that is restricted to evaluation. But there may still be some element of them that you want to replicate, and that needs to be done in context. And I think what we're starting to see is that there are mechanisms in the intersection of computer science and clinical medicine, such as silent trials, where essentially you replicate some of those technical validation studies, but in the real world context, that are a potential answer to that. And sort of finally, I feel like the preceding presentations have really highlighted this. We have to understand these systems not as technical tools really, but as complex and socio-technical interventions. Complex in the sense that they are multi-component often, that they have impacts on workflow and workload, and that they're often combined within broader patterns of care, which may be modified in unexpected ways. And of course, noting that technical measurement, particularly of the kind that is reported widely in the computer science literature, really only captures some of those relevant concerns. And we saw that example in relation to clinical decision support, that poor workload fit will lead to non-use. And so last, in terms of a high level conclusion, I want to highlight this, I think, which is that, being thoughtful about measurement of real world impacts is incredibly important. And I think we have to get better at standardizing that and doing it reliably and reporting it better. But I think it's part of a bigger problem in this space, which is that there are some really quite fundamental misalignments, I think, between how clinical folk understand these problems and how they are then interpreted in the computer science space, how issues are prioritized to be addressed and resolved during development. And I also think there are some underlying ethical issues and mismatches, particularly in the commercial space around AI. And these are challenges that apply right throughout the design and evaluation landscape, and we're going to have to navigate them and get better at navigating them. But I will pause there, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing points. I don't know where to begin. I have so many questions. So as just a reminder, you are allowed to raise your hand, and I'll happily unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and ask questions. Mark and I have prepared a few questions, so I'm just going to use my advantage and ask my first question. But then let's see where this conversation takes us. Thank you very much again to all the speakers. I guess my first question goes first to clinicians. So what kinds of decisions do you feel are appropriate to delegate to algorithms, and where do you draw the line? Is that like a rule of thumb? Chris, Kit, Abhijit. I'll have questions for Portia later.
I can jump in if no one else wants to, but I guess what I would say is a lot of that depends on the level of experience and training of the health worker in question. So, for example, our tool was really targeted at semi-skilled primary health center workers, in rural Cambodia, but it would certainly not be appropriate to guide decision making for, a specialist physician in Australia. So I think that's probably the first thing, to bear in mind. That I guess the general rule of thumb, in my view, would be the lower the level of experience and training, then the more you can use an algorithm to guide what you do, but also recognizing that at the end of the day, a clinician carries clinical responsibility for the management and outcomes, right? So the algorithm should really just serve as a guide, and if they're in their clinical judgment, what the algorithm recommends, they feel very strongly about, then they should also be allowed to use that autonomy and act independently. But that's my take on it. Don't know if Kit and Bridget have other opinions.
So I'd love to add a bit of color to that, because I think a result that's come out recently from some recent meta-analyses is that sometimes human-computer collaborations can be worse, and that often that worse behavior is seen amongst trainees because they lack the ability to judge when a model output is poor. And so I think there is that potential for real tension where if you're handing decision making over to an algorithm that they may then potentially be consumed by a staff member, but if we give it to the staff members who are least able to deploy judgment as to whether that's appropriate or not, that can lead to harm. So I think we're still figuring that out to some extent as to the match, but it's up front it seems like a sensible thing to do, to match skill and sort of fill in gaps in skill with AI techniques.
Thanks. Marco, you had a fantastic follow-up question on this.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, following on this, I wonder about accountability. So basically, as algorithmic decision tools become more autonomous and embedded into clinical practice, how can we ensure accountability? What kind of regulatory frameworks do we need? And this is really important in high-income countries, but especially in low and middle-income context, in which sort of the regulatory context may be not sufficiently developed. So should we rethink traditional models of clinical care responsibility?
Any takers?
I don't know if I have an answer, but I have an observation. There's a phenomenon that I think has been well named in the space, which is called moral outsourcing, and it relates to the stance that the again in the kind of commercial end of development in this space, AI builders and computer scientists view the kinds of problems we've been talking about as solely the preserve of the implementers. And it's a form of moral outsourcing to the extent that, you know, those harms are then sort of disattributed to the engineers. But I'm pretty clear, I think, that, you know, these are engineered systems for which there is, you know, better or poorer engineering choices, and therefore the challenge we need to navigate, or the heart of this problem is how do we build systems of accountability that extend up the chain into the people who are engineering them. And I think one element of that could be transparency in reporting of harms. But, you know, we expect that harms happen at low rates. And so in the same way that we have yellow card mechanisms for pharmaceutical agents, I think there may be opportunities around this. I mean, you know, particularly for systems that are being used repeatedly or at scale. It's not a whole answer, but I think us on the clinical side of the fence trying to solve this problem, or assuming that we're the only one, you know, we have to do the band-aids to deal with algorithmic problems, that can't be only the answer.
Thanks, Kit. That was really useful and enlightening. Yeah, and adding to that, we need to consider that as this technology is becoming increasingly complex, they are increasingly black box. So the level of scrutiny that we have is increasingly low, or at least available or accessible to only a very few experts. So the artificial intelligence models is exceedingly complex. So there are very, very significant challenges way beyond the sort of normal or standard clinical practice, which is complex enough, but this is adding an extra layer of complexity.
Portia, go ahead, please.
I realize the question wasn't directed at me as a non-clinician, but I just thought it would be useful to introduce the nuance that design choices can make a clinical decision support tool. They can be designed to either increase cognitive load or decrease it, and that increased cognitive load is not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that there are some decisions where the tool might know better than the clinician, and there are some decisions where the tool is actually introduced, and I wish I could pull the paper out of my memory right away, but a tool, there's an example of a sort of a sepsis alert tool introduced in Stanford, where the tool is specifically designed to encourage conversation and discussion within a clinical team huddling about the patient's deterioration prospects, rather sort of introducing more kind of cognitive thinking, making clinicians sort of stop and think and react to it, rather than offloading that cognitive load onto the tool. And I think what's interesting about this is that those are kind of post-modeling, post-engineering design decisions about how that information is supposed to be incorporated into the clinical workflow. But I don't know how you regulate that.
I do have a follow-up question in terms of, did you want to go, Marco?
No, please go ahead, Susan.
It's kind of linking to the role. So we're talking about here across different health systems, and I think it was a point that you also raised. So the MBS in Australia doesn't fund AI tools. Should we expect the public health system to take a more active role in developing, validating, and regulating these tools? Should we leave that to the private developers with the regulation set up by the public system? How would we see this in systems where in low and middle income countries where perhaps the infrastructures and the government and the institutions are not quite as strong as they are in other countries?
Yeah, also because some of these systems, Susan, are proprietary, so are not open at all to sort of public scrutiny. So this is an additional issue. Not all software is open source. I can see there are also some questions in the chat box, and Tan is asking whether failure to integrate in some of the AI tools is a failure of clinical governance and oversight. Personally, I don't think it's a failure. I think that sort of governance, including in the medical field and as in many other domains, has not yet been able to keep pace with the incredibly rapid advances in technology, and particularly in the past couple of years, artificial intelligence. I think everyone has been taken a bit by surprise, and yeah.
So there is another question in the chat. It's from Jun Tao, and it says, do you think it is possible to require the algorithm AI tools, given the reasons or deduction process about how they draw the conclusions? I don't understand the question. Is Jun Tao in the room?
All right, I'll just
Yes,
jump on.
Portia, go ahead.
Well, so
Um,
Juntel, let me see if I can break down your question a little bit, and then I'll pause and you can let me know if I've interpreted it correctly. I think there are two pieces to this question. And overall, it's sort of referring to, I think, what's commonly understood as kind of like the black box problem of AI, which is that the more sophisticated algorithms get when you get into machine learning and deep learning algorithms, you can't point to parameter weights and say like, well, the weighting on that was 0.6 and that was present, and so because of our regression equation, like that's how this answer was spit out. That is actually very complicated. So there are two questions embedded within your question. One is it useful to try and reverse engineer a kind of sort of intuitive interpretation of a machine learning or deep learning recommendation? And then the second is that from a policy perspective, even if it's useful, can you actually regulate and require? Is it useful to regulate that this should be done? I think there are arguments now, and this is where I'm really curious for other folks to weigh in on this. My understanding of the literature so far is that the answer to both is no. That the first is that when you try and take output from a machine learning or deep learning algorithm, and sort of make it quote unquote interpretable to a sort of smart but non-expert user, you're kind of making stuff up in a way that might or might not actually accurately represent what's going on, quote, sort of under the hood. And so it's not clear how much that's actually how helpful that is if it's actually misinforming the user about how the answer came about. And the second one is, can you regulate it? And I have a pretty strong opinion about that, which is that once you that my imagination goes wild considering the potential unintended consequences of this is how you have to this is how AI or machine learning output has to be represented. That the potential usability issues and unintended consequences of trying to on a policy level to regulate sort of specific outputs start to get just ridiculous. I can imagine a lot of stories where that would just make things unusable. So that's my take. Curious about others. Chantal, did I interpret your question correctly, or did I just go off on a total different tangent?
That's definitely correct. That's what I was going to ask. Yeah, two questions. One is that able to, show the transparency. Another one is able to regulate this type of transparency to give the deduction process. Yeah.
So mine is sort of a yes and to Portia's response. I think that there's also an element in this about the user experience and process of decision making from the clinician point of view. And I'm not entirely convinced that clinical narratives about what they do, what people do or don't need for decision making have been really well tested or explored empirically in context. So I think there is a dominant narrative that explainability is important, but I think there's plenty to do in the space of actually figuring out what information in what forms at the point of decision making are optimal, bearing in mind that bringing together those different information from different sources, potentially disparate sources, comes with cost, both in terms of development time and also, setting up data integrations and infrastructure. The one thing I'd just say in terms of algorithms, so certain types of algorithms, such as rule-based algorithms, all the way back to linear regression, are probably, they are theoretically explainable in terms of the contribution of betas, for example, in regression to the output, although I think that's still pretty limited. I strongly agree with Portia that when you get into deep learning technologies, the prospect of meaningful explanation is disappears, but there are techniques for assessing things like model uncertainty that can be useful. So for example, what you can do is you can replay the model with a whole load of simple variations to the patient characteristics that were fed into it and assess the extent to which its output would change. And that may be useful. So there's sort of a toolkit, but it's not a panacea.
Just
Yeah,
Chris.
thanks.
Just to say that I do agree with you, Kate, and with you, Portia, but I think it does underscore the importance of stakeholder engagement, and certainly what we're talking about here really pertains to the end user. And I guess when you want to develop an algorithmic tool, it would really be important, right from the start to engage with the end users and find out exactly what is it that they would find most useful if such a tool were to be developed, and then really prioritize that in the process. I don't really have an answer to the regulation question, but I did notice someone previously said, should public institutions or public, hospitals take a role in developing algorithmic tools. And I think we do have some precedent, and certainly if you look at Royal Melbourne, they have developed guidance, MS, for antimicrobial stewardship. There is various, pharmacokinetic, dosing programs or antibiotic dosing, some of which have either been developed in the public sector or are open source. And so I think there certainly, has been precedent for these. Regulation is, more difficult, I think, in for example, low and middle income countries, but certainly for high income countries, I think a lot of them, if they were to gain traction, for more widespread use, you would like to see that, for example, they have been assessed kind of like as a medical device by the Therapeutic Goods Authority or similar.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
We have 5 more minutes. So before I let everybody go, I would like to thank you again, and thanks everybody for joining us. I do have one last question and your opportunity to do a closing statement. So my last question is, if you had just one policy recommendation to ensure algorithmic tools in healthcare serve patients equitably and effectively, what would it be? Where do we put all our eggs? Chris, would you like to?
I'll jump. Yeah, sure. So I'd say engage, and not just with the developers, but also the end users, i.e. the healthcare workers, but also the people who set policy, and obviously the patients themselves, because all of these groups have to have trust in the tool that's being developed or rolled out, right? And through this engagement, you can also understand the contextual factors which are influencing what they're telling you. So I think that would really be where I would be focusing my efforts.
Thank you. Abhijit?
I totally agree with Chris. As we did this clinical trial in Cambodian setup, we regularly got healthcare workers and also the stakeholders, provincial health department, coming together and discussing about discussing about how it's going, what's going on, and how the tools are helping. So I think this is very important to engage every stakeholders, healthcare workers, what Chris mentioned, and also the designing team. Designing of the tools should be co-designed with the local clinicians and local healthcare workers to help these kind of algorithmic tools to prosper and success. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhijit. Portia?
I'm really glad that you said that, Abhijit, because that was one of the things I was considering as my final plug. So you took that one. So I think I'm going to say that value-based payment design, particularly I think in what's in Australia currently still very much a fee-for-service space, starting to consider to I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. Paying for outcomes is really difficult. But in the public health system with activity-based payment and activity-based costing, there are more opportunities, I think, for incentivizing a hospital system to invest in tools. But right now, we keep running into a disconnect from the ideas of developers and founders who have a great idea for a digital tool, and they're like, and my business plan is to get this approved as an MBS item. Then we're kind of having to be sort of a voice in the room going, well, right now there's not a great avenue for that to happen. So they're gonna, so you're looking at specialists or GPs who are just gonna have to make the business decision to invest in your tool. And they want to take good care of their patients. And so a payment system shouldn't be set up as a roadblock. It should be set up to enable physicians taking good care of their patients and improving outcomes and value. So.
Wow, that's gonna be hard.
Didn't say it was going to be easy.
No, that was not the question. Kid.
Also pretty hard to follow up after all of those recommendations. And I agree. I agree with them all. I'm super happy that they're on the table. I want to take it in a slightly different direction. I think there is such accumulated evidence of the scope for equity harms from these tools, relating to everything from the way initial training data sets are constituted through to the way we choose the particular things we're training against, that I think there should be mandatory reporting of equity KPIs for all clinical algorithm deployments in public healthcare organizations. I think we need something like that to like require the upstream changes to happen.
That's a great closing statement. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Marco, would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, thanks everyone. That was really interesting. So yeah, maybe just my final point is that once again, all these governance issues are also made very difficult due to the sheer complexity of these technologies. And given that this is a semi-webinar of the Health Economics Association, we can draw a comparison with blockchain technologies in finance. Blockchains and cryptography are definitely revolutionizing finance in many significant ways and bringing a lot of innovations. But I wonder how many people do really understand what they mean and how they operate to the level that this can be an object of public scrutiny, even amongst sort of economists. I mean, there are not so many that really understand the nitty-gritty of how sort of Bitcoin works, for example, and the same goes for artificial intelligence in healthcare. So the world is becoming something that we increasingly do not understand and make sense of unless we are really expert and competent. So this is a very important challenge in the coming years, how to make this technology how to present this technology in a way that people can actually understand and engage them in a meaningful way. But thanks, that was great. Thank you so much for your contributions, and it was a really pleasant hour.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, Da. I've learned so much. And thanks again for joining us, and thanks for your time. These were fantastic speakers. Thanks, Dai, for waking up super, super early and facilitating this forum. And enjoy your afternoon, rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Marco.
Thank you.
very much to everyone.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
weekend,
That was
everyone.
excellent.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thanks for Chunky. I'll follow up on an email for both of you.